I will be talking about my own personal journey, the way in which my thoughts and feelings about Christianity have changed over the course, not just of the past few years, but of my entire life. Thank you for coming here tonight, and thank you so much for the invitation. The title of this talk was given to me, Why I Changed My Mind About Christianity. And so in a sense, this talk will be quite a personal one. I will be talking about my own personal journey, the way in which my thoughts and feelings about Christianity have changed over the course, not just of the past few years, but of my entire life. And so over the course of my late childhood into my teenage years, it was the glamour and the swagger and the charisma of the classical world that really seduced me. So I much preferred the Greek gods to the Christian God. And when I thought of the Roman world or the Greek world and compared it to the world of Christianity, to me, the Greek world and the Roman world seemed a world full of color. It had bright, clear blue skies, brilliant white marble, gold, purple. And when I thought of the world brought in by Christianity, when I thought of what in England we call the Dark Ages, it did seem dark. It seemed a bit like the weather today, kind of grey, leaves falling, puddles, mud. I turned to write the writing of history as my career. It was to Rome and to Greece that I turned, rather than to Christianity. Because by that point, essentially, my faith had faded. It hadn't been a kind of spectacular repudiation of religion. It hadn't been anything like that. I still valued it, but I didn't believe it anymore. And in a sense, it had been blotted out by the great blaze of colour that for me was what Greece and Rome were all about. Britain, the first book was about the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Republic. So an incredibly glamorous period of history, Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, all that kind of thing. And then the second one was about the Persian Wars, again, incredibly glamorous, the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, great, surging, rolling drama and heroism. But I found the project of spending 2-3 years trying to inhabit the heads of the Romans and the Greeks an increasingly unsettling and, in fact, disturbing experience. So, writing about Julius Caesar, for instance, one of the figures who had obsessed me as a child, when I wrote about Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, what's now France, it was a horrendous narrative. It was a narrative of genocide and enslavement. Caesar, it is said, slaughtered 1 million Gauls in the course of his conquest. He enslaved another 1 million. And to the Romans, these were not crimes. In fact, these were achievements to be celebrated. When Caesar staged his triumph, his great procession of victory through the streets of Rome, prisoners followed his chariot, placards were carried, boasting of the feats of slaughter and annihilation that Caesar had accomplished. And I found this, as I say, unsettling. And when I came to write about the Battle of Thermopylae, perhaps the most heroic doomed defeat, doomed stand in the whole of history, the 300 Spartans dying for the sake of Sparta and for liberty, a story that had always, again, thrilled me from my childhood, and tried to get inside the heads of the Spartans. Again, I found it a deeply, deeply disturbing place to be. The Spartans had provided the Nazis with their blueprint for the occupation of much of Eastern Europe. The Spartans had enslaved a fellow Greek city, turned their fellow Greeks into slaves, and depended on these slaves for the maintenance of their warrior society. Notoriously, when children were born, they would have to be brought to a council of elders who would inspect the children, and if it was felt that these babies would not measure up, either as warriors or as the breeders of warriors, then they would be flung down a ravine. And again, as I say, I found this disturbing. And I began to ask myself, well, why do I find it disturbing? Because in a way, the most unsettling thing about both, say, Rome or Sparta was the fact that nobody in these societies seemed to find their morals and their values unsettling at all. If they were cruel, then it was, if they were callous, then it was, in a way, kind of innocently callous. And so I thought, well, what has changed? What changed was that Christianity came along. And for the Romans, there were many religiones because there were many gods. There were many ways of joining the Roman people to the worship of the gods. But for the Christians, there was only one religio. And in the 5th century, the early 5th century, Rome was sacked. And the shock of this was felt across the Roman world. And people who worshipped the old gods, people who felt that the old religiones should be maintained, they said, this is the fault of the Christians. We have abandoned the religiones of the gods, and so they have turned their backs on us. But the great father of the Latin Church, St. Augustine, his response was, this is not true. And he the word that he fixed on was one that immediately kind of made my ears prick up, because he said, actually, Rome, the Roman Empire, like all human life, belongs to the dimension of the saeculum. And the saeculum in Latin means the span of human life. And more broadly, it means the way in which things that are born, live, are doomed to die. Essentially, so essentially, the saeculum for Augustine means the flux of the fallen world, the way in which nothing is forever. And he counterpoints this to the dimension of heaven, where all is radiant and eternal. And the only way that fallen humanity can attain this radiant eternity, Augustine said, is thanks to the religio, the bond that is provided by the church. I began to ask myself, if our morals are so different, if our values are so different, and if the very way we understand society is so different, what was the full impact of Christianity? Just how profound was this process of change? And the more I thought about it, the more it came to seem to me that this was actually the profoundest revolution, not just in a European understanding of the world, but because the Latin forms of Christianity, the Catholic and the Protestant forms, have spread across the world. It's a global religion, a global revolution as well. And so I set myself the task of writing a book which I came to call Dominion, to see just how total was this process of revolution, just how totally transformed by Christianity was the West. And the further corollary of that, in a world that sees itself in the West as being increasingly post-Christian, as being secular, how Christian does it remain? And the conclusion that I came to was that essentially all of us in the West are like goldfish swimming in Christian waters. We don't recognize that we're swimming in Christian waters because we're in our bowl. But if you can get outside that bowl, then you see just how Christian those waters are. And so I set myself to writing a book that would trace the evolution of this Christian revolution from the pre-Christian world right the way up to the present day. And I'd written 2 or 3 chapters of it when I got a commission from a British TV company to go to Iraq to make a film about what it was that motivated the Islamic State, ISIS, this radically, brutally militant Islamist organization. And specifically to focus on why it was that they were targeting Christians and a particular religious minority called Yazidis for persecution. And so I went to Iraq, and we got permission from the Kurdish government in the north of the country to visit a city called Sinjar. And Sinjar had been, there had been Christians settled there, there'd been Shia Muslims there, Sunni Muslims, and a lot of Yazidis. There aren't many Yazidis in the world. There are about, I should think, about 300,000. But a sizable proportion of them were in this particular town called Sinjar. And in 2014, when the Islamic State moved from Syria into northern Iraq, captured Mosul, they also captured Sinjar. And while they were in Sinjar, they crucified many of the men, and they enslaved many of the women, and not just women. They enslaved girls who were as young as 8. And in 2016, Sinjar got recaptured by the Kurds, and we were allowed to go there a few weeks after the city had been recaptured. But it was still in an absolutely appalling state, and the Islamic State themselves were still a couple of miles kind of flat no man's land between the Kurdish positions and their own positions. So we went there, and it was a scene of utter and literal desecration. So that's me looking miserable. I'm not a naturally brave person. If I'd known that I was going to end up in this terrible place being shelled by the Islamic State, I would never have gone. And there was a definite sense that what had particularly aggravated the fighters who came there and who desecrated the church was the cross. So again, to go back to that, that's why there was a very beautiful crucifix there. It had been demolished, and so that's why the people who came back have put the cross back up. It was a terrifying and horrifying experience. But what I found most terrifying and most horrifying was the sense that I was in an environment, in a town that had been destroyed by people for whom the cross did not have the significance that it had for me and for the society in which I had grown up. That for the Islamic State, the cross served as a symbol of their right to inflict violence on people who resisted them. And this is what the cross had symbolized for the Romans. It had symbolized for them their right to torture to death anyone who presumed to defy their power. And the horror of this kind of seemed to open up a great abyss before me. And I came back from filming in Sinjar, came back from Iraq, returned to my book, and I rewrote the opening to focus on the crucifixion. Because that experience had sharpened for me the utter strangeness of what perhaps can seem too familiar to people who have grown up in a Christian society. The weirdness of the fact that the symbol of Christianity, the great marker of its identity, should be an instrument of torture. Now, we know that this seemed very, very strange to the earliest Christians as well. And we know that because in the earliest Christian texts we have, the letters written by Paul, it haunts him. He's obsessed by the strangeness of the fact that the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah, who in some strange way that Paul can't quite pin down, is a part of the one God, the omnipotent, all-creating, all-powerful God. That he did not come as a conqueror, he did not come as a ruler of the world, but he came as someone who suffered the most monstrous death that the Roman Empire could inflict on its subjects. Because to the Romans, crucifixion was such a monstrous and horrifying punishment that it was seen as being the paradigmatic fate to be visited not just on rebels against Roman power, but specifically on slaves. Was because it wasn't just because it was so painful, it wasn't just because it was protracted, but because it was public, and so your sufferings, your humiliations were visible for everyone to see. The fact that crucifixion is so disgusting is something that causes Paul anxiety. And it seems to have caused Christians anxiety throughout the early centuries of the spread of Christ's message across the Roman world. People know that Christ was crucified. They know that in some way this must have been the point, that Christ must have chosen this most humiliating of deaths, that in a way the last shall be first and the first shall be last, that this is the lesson. And it's not until 100 years after the conversion of Constantine that we start to get art that shows Christ on the cross. And I think that Christians in the West become so habituated to the horrors of the crucifixion that they end up anesthetized to them. They become oblivious to them. We've become desensitized to what crucifixion meant. And I think that is why I found the experience of going to Sinjar so unsettling and so upsetting. And the paradox is that I would say that of all the modern writers, all the modern thinkers who have written about the crucifixion, the one who understood the strangeness that lies at the heart of Christianity, the fact that the crucifixion utterly upended things that the Romans and the Greeks had taken for granted, was not actually a Christian at all, but perhaps the most notorious of all modern atheists. And here he is, Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche said of the crucifixion that to devise something which could even approach the seductive, intoxicating, anesthetizing, and corrupting power of that symbol of the Holy Cross, that horrific paradox of the crucified God, that mystery of an inconceivably ultimate, most extreme, cruel, and self-crucifixion undertaken for the salvation of mankind. How revolting that was. And it seemed revolting to Nietzsche because Nietzsche valued the martial, heroic qualities of the Greek and Roman world, that he understood the crucifixion destabilized. I think then the way in which the crucifixion stands at the heart of Christian society has continued to shape its assumptions, its ideals, the things it takes for granted, even perhaps as institutional Christianity fades. But I would say that even though it was hostile to Christianity, even though it destroyed and bulldozed churches, nevertheless, that communist regime would have been unthinkable without Christianity. The idea that the last shall be first and the first shall be last, fundamental to Marx's teachings. Where do they come from, if not from the Bible? The idea that there will be a day of reckoning, a day of judgment for the oppressors of the proletariat, a day of judgment. Again, unthinkable without the Bible. So the paradox is, I think, that so deeply and profoundly does the cross lie at the heart of our civilization that even French revolutionaries, even Russian revolutionaries, even the regime that came to power here after the Second World War, unthinkable without Christianity. Nietzsche, when he prophesied the ultimate extinction of Christianity, he looked and he said, the destruction of Christianity, by which he meant not just institutional Christianity, but its beliefs and its values, will usher in a time of great convulsions, and deeds of terrible horror will be done. And he was right. I would say that if communism self-evidently bears the enduring stamp of Christianity, fascism, and Nazism perhaps especially, is the most radically anti-Christian ideology, and therefore the most radically revolutionary ideology that has emerged in Europe since the time of Constantine. And that's not just because it aimed at the eradication of institutional Christianity, although it absolutely did. It's also because it targeted for destruction perhaps two of the most fundamental values that Christianity has always embodied, that are kind of bound up in Paul's letters and ever since with the idea of Christ's sufferings on the cross, and aimed to destroy them in a way that continues to reverberate into the present. So the first is the idea that Paul extrapolates from the fact that Christ suffered on the cross for all of humanity, not just for Jews, not just for Greeks, but for everybody. That in Christ there is no Jew or Greek, as Paul famously wrote to the Galatians. This is something that the Nazis utterly repudiate. Of course they think that Jews and Greeks are different. In fact, Hitler blames the Jews for Paul. He blames the Jews for Christianity. He blames the Jews for corrupting and destroying the civilization of Greece and Rome, which perhaps is the most grotesque irony in history, that Hitler targeted the Jews for genocide because he blamed them for Christianity. But the Nazis also repudiated the idea that is manifest in the emblem of the cross, that it is better to suffer than to inflict suffering, that it is better to be the slave who is tortured by the master than the master who is torturing the slave, that in humiliation and death there is ultimate triumph and victory. Rather, as Nietzsche had done, look back to the pre-Christian world for the ideal of what they felt humanity should be, or at least the section of humanity that Hitler wanted to see triumph. Namely, conquest, power, strength, vigor, and that anything or anyone that opposed that had to be destroyed, which is why it wasn't only the Jews who were targeted for destruction, but those who were disabled, those who were weak, those who, back in Sparta, would have been flung down a cliff. In a society that is increasingly turning its back on the church, our horror at what the Nazis did give us a moral framework that remains Christian. So it's a moral framework in which Hitler is the devil. Nazis are demons. Auschwitz is hell. And if before the Second World War, people in the West would say, what should I do? I will do as Jesus did. Now when people say, what should I do? By and large, people say, I will do the opposite of what Hitler did. But I think the problem with this, for people in the West, is that merely calling people you don't like Nazis lacks the incredible complexity, the sophistication, the compassion, the moral profundity that Christianity for 2,000 years has embodied. And I think it's a kind of ersatz form of Christianity. Just deriving our morals from a sense of what Hitler was and doing the opposite, I think in the long run is inadequate, which is why I'm so grateful for the invitation to come and talk to you today, and grateful for what you do, because I think that Christianity is the seedbed of everything that makes the West what it is. And without it, I kind of worry where we may end up. So thank you very much.